There is a spectrum of threat that goes from the existential, like we're all going to get turned into paperclips, to the exceptionally creepy. But, you know, like there's going to be AI teddy bears whispering to our kids, and who knows what they say.
Welcome back to My Robot Teacher. Our guest today is Jason Goldman, who's one of the hosts of the highly entertaining podcast Escape Hatch, formerly Dune Pod, a genre movie podcast that has some fantastic analyses of sci-fi films that shape our cultural imagination of AI.
Jason also worked at Google, Twitter, and in 2015 became the first chief digital officer of the White House.
Before we get into our conversation with Jason, we want to explain why we're going to be talking about Terminator and her and cultural perceptions of Silicon Valley and the tech industry on a podcast about AI in higher education. We've talked before on this podcast about how the stories that we tell about technology shape what we think is possible and what we fear and also what we overlook. And so, for example, when my students say they won't use their CSU-provided ChatGPT EDU accounts because they think it's a sting operation for plagiarism and they prefer to use the free accounts, that is potentially the result of them absorbing narratives about which institutions they should trust, which institutions they should fear, and expectations about which types of surveillance they're likely to experience and be threatened by.
Right. But let's be real here. Faculty aren't immune to these kinds of cultural narratives either.
Totally.
So, for example, when we imagine AI risks, many of us jump straight to Skynet-style apocalypse, like, you know, from Terminator.
I think I did, right?
And that can mean that we miss other potential futures.
Like when we're culturally primed to focus on one very extreme dystopian premise, we might actually be missing the quiet, slowly accumulating harms that, you know, also and maybe end up turning us into zombies.
Oh my God. Well, I mean, like, sure. But like, you know, what about maybe the positive stuff? Like, if you're fixated on one nightmare scenario, you might miss both those kinds of quieter harms, I suppose, but also the genuine benefits.
Okay, got it. So it's like, I wonder if there's a parallel here too, or if you're focusing only on like academic integrity fears, you miss what Jason in this episode helps us identify as more insidious risks, like students forming parasocial attachments to chatbots or surveillance that works not through cameras with the blinking red light, as the film trope depicts, but through like invisible behavioral profiling.
And, you know, we might also miss or even dismiss legitimate educational uses like accessibility or multilingual support or scaffolding that helps students who've never had access to really, truly personalized feedback.
Well, today we're examining which movie tropes are helping us think clearly about AI in higher education and which ones are going to lead us astray. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to talk with Jason. As Tayo mentioned, he's also somebody who's lived inside the machinery, so to speak, of Silicon Valley and thought deeply about how pop culture portrays it. So like how movies, media, and other forms of public imagination shape what we expect from technology and what we overlook. And so this episode is very much about how stories about the tech world also shape the way educators, and for that matter, the public, understand AI's promises and perils. Spoiler alert, we are about to ruin Terminator, WarGames, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and her by giving away the major plot points on this episode.
Before we get to the interview with Jason, we do have a favor to ask. You know, we're a small podcast operation. We're supported by the Learning Lab. We love them, but we don't have an advertising budget. We really depend on you all to help us grow this community. So please, if you enjoy what you're listening to, share the podcast with a friend, share it with a colleague. Help us grow this community by maybe leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or subscribing on YouTube. Anything that you can do to help is greatly appreciated. Now on to the interview. Hi, Jason.
Thank you for having me.
We're very glad to have you here. Very excited to talk about representations of AI in film. I wanted to add too that I also learned that you were one of the original employees at Twitter from that documentary Breaking the Bird. And there was this amazing clip of you reading a tweet from like 2007 that was about continuing to work on things that will apparently destroy the world.
Yeah, I have mixed feelings about that tweet because I think at the time I was like, oh, like people are complaining about social media. which wasn't even called that yet then. And they're saying like, oh, this is going to destroy people's brains, it'll be bad. And I had been working on, the social web previously at Blogger for about 7 years or something like that, 5 years at that point. And so I was like, oh yeah, like, this is what people say. They don't like new technology and it's going to destroy things. But then turns out it did kind of break our brains. So it turns out that I was wrong.
Well, we were thinking about it. Right now, it is so controversial that the Cal State University system where we work has done this deal with OpenAI, given ChatGPT EDU accounts to all of the students, faculty, and staff. And there's a lot of people who are super anxious about this. But I think the question we want to think about is, their technology is developing right now, and in the moment, it can be really hard to anticipate what the consequences can be. And how do we temper our maybe more apocalyptic, less likely visions, and then think seriously about more insidious threats like surveillance, for instance, or the potential to break down democracy.
Yeah, there is a spectrum of threat that goes from the existential, like we're all going to get turned into paperclips, to the exceptionally creepy. But, there's going to be AI teddy bears whispering to our kids and who knows what they say. But there's also tremendous upside too. Like, again, the upsides run the gamut from might cure cancer to, my son had show and tell this week in first grade and he brought in a mineral and I needed to give him tips on how to explain what the mineral was to a 7-year-old, 6-7-year-old audience. ChatGPT nailed it. Just absolutely crushed that one.
So you were at the sort of forefront of a lot of the social web stuff, as you say. Was there much awareness of perhaps the downside risks of social media and maybe of Twitter and that sort of thing while it was being built? Or were you more just interested in trying to build this cool thing and putting it out there in the world?
So particularly in the 2002 to 2008 timeframe, when it was all very early, I would say that the overwhelming zeal to try to show that this is something that people might actually use and do was so intense that I think it both blinded us to some of the downstream risks, as well as made us really celebrate anything that looked like a unique benefit of doing this. But the environment that we were up against, this was true even, when I worked on Blogger at Google. You're working at Google in 2003, 2004, some of the best technologists in the world building Google, people who obviously believe in the internet. But there was extreme skepticism from the founders at Google, from early employees at Google of why would anyone ever want to write a blog? No one's ever going to want to do this. And so when we were talking about the internet and the web in particular as a canvas of self-expression, a place where people would go to kind of illustrate parts of themselves, that just seemed completely foreign to the Google way of viewing the world, which is the internet is this vast repository of knowledge. We need to organize it and make it useful. It was a place where you got stuff out as opposed to a place where you put things. And we were like, no, it's great. People do all kinds of weird stuff. People do weird stuff all day long on this thing if you give them the tools to do it. And that idea that the internet would be a place where people put parts of themselves was really not widely embraced even among technologists. So I think having to kind of run counter to that blinds you to some of the risks.
That is super fascinating. And I think we're all in the same generation. And so I'm actually a little bit surprised as I think back on my own coming of age, with the internet memory. And I can't really remember a time when it wasn't a space where people expressed themselves. I love that phrase you used, Jason, a canvas of self-expression. But I'm wondering back then, who in the room making decisions about how to build these technologies was actually living or experimenting with self-expression on these platforms?
It's interesting. My experience, having been both an extremely online person since I was on BBSs in the early 90s in St. Louis, Missouri, as well as a technologist who helped build these systems, is that the Venn diagram of those two sets of people doesn't intersect as much as you might think. There are a lot of people who are early adopters of technology who really find a way that it excites something in their soul. And I was like, oh, I'm going to put part of myself into this machine and use it to find other people. And then there are people who are like, I want to build these systems. And some of the people who want to build the systems also are the people that enjoy putting their souls online. But as an example, of the 3 founders of Twitter, really none of them tweeted particularly well. Biz was maybe the exception to it. Ev and Jack are terrible at it, have never been good at it. Ev had a blog back in the day, but like, and that was like something he at least saw, but like primarily kind of as like through a business lens, as opposed to like, this is parts of my soul lens. And like Jack, like, yeah, just didn't like, that was not how he expressed himself, personally. And so it's, you really do see these dichotomies of, then there are these people who are out there in all corners of the world who have no professional interest in technology in terms of building the systems. They're not coders, but they're just like, oh, I know exactly what to do with this. I'm going to start like talking about like, my fantasy world of like, elves and whatever. And I'm going to talk about knitting, and I'm going to talk about my cat, and I'm going to put pictures of all this stuff. And I'm just going to create this rich, imaginative universe. And you're like, wow, like, who taught you that? I was like, no one. They just like sort of sense that that's what could be done. So yeah, it's an interesting dichotomy that I found to be true.
I love this because I think one of the reasons I'm interested in technology in film, like the representations of different technology in film, is because I teach these classes where it's like, let's look at how all of these narratives about what's possible or what you think is possible come from from tropes and things that you've absorbed, kind of tacit knowledge you take in from the things you read and the things you experience. And then you get something that is really innovative, that completely reframes how you might think about something.
Totally. And I think this sort of like aggravates like one of my more frequent hobby horses with respect to the tech industry, which is that I think one of the reasons why these two sets of people are don't have as much overlap as you might think is that I think a lot of people who build the systems who work in tech are not particularly good readers. I find that they have like, they like science fiction, they like fantasy, they like genre fiction, but I don't think they've read deeply into like sort of the import of the work that they've named their companies after, or the work, the work that they have, sort of purport to be super fans of, which leads, of course, to like, the somewhat infamous Torment Nexus paradox.
I don't know this.
The Torment Nexus paradox is like, science fiction writer says, oh, I've just written this amazing book called The Torment Nexus. It describes how like by using this technology, you'll bring the ruin to mankind. And the tech entrepreneur says, proud to introduce my new company, The Torment Nexus. It's like, it's a recurring pattern where I think like the people who, and then you've got people who are great readers and do deeply delve into fictional worlds. And they're the ones that use the tools to express themselves or find something that tickles their own fancy and express themselves and become passionate user of the tools, but they're not necessarily the ones building it.
You tell us what you think are the kind of motifs or tropes in film that have informed much of how people are thinking about AI. What strikes you as being the most dominant, and maybe how many of those are like relevant or irrelevant?
Yeah. I mean, the Skynet one, like, Skynet from Terminator generally is pretty relevant because it is the idea of you build an AI and it gets out of control. And there's this accelerated timeline of like, the system gains consciousness and then that leads to the ruin of the world. Like seeing that, for Cameron to kind of seeing that as early as he did is a pretty remarkable insight, because that is the alignment problem and is a pretty good shorthand for the alignment problem and the particular concern that once a super intelligence is reached, the machine could be continually self-improving and quickly outstrip the ability to just pull the plug. The Skynet is also a perfect example of the Torment Nexus paradox, because I saw this documentary, I think it was a Vice documentary, where they went to China and they interviewed an entrepreneur who was building surveillance systems for China. And like in China, you're kind of always building surveillance system for the CCP as well. And so they were like, yeah, we built this system. And like, look, like we'll do a test where you can find, someone, we put out an alert for like this person, this test subject, and we can find them anywhere in Shanghai in like, 45 seconds or whatever. And it's like, oh, great. What do you call it? It's like, we call the system Skynet. It's like, and like the interviewer, he was like, you understand, like Skynet was the bad computer in Terminator. It's like, yes, it's called Skynet after the movie Terminator. It's like, okay, cool. Yeah. So I think that happened. That example, I think, is that Skynet and Terminator is a pretty good one that captured attention.
Recognizable brand name.
Yeah, good brand.
That's definitely a trope. It appears like in many artifacts, right? Particularly in cinema. One that comes to mind that I really am a huge fan of and was deeply, I don't know why, I just love this movie, is WarGames. Have you seen that one?
Oh yeah.
It kind of combines two world-shaking technologies, nuclear weapons and the possibility, of course, of existential doom from nuclear weapons, but also there's artificial intelligence kind of featured quite prominently in there. It opens the movie by demonstrating how human beings aren't up to the task of launching the missiles that are going to annihilate, millions of people and that sort of thing. So they replace all of the humans there with a computer system. And that computer system ends up, kind of being a real problem for humanity.
Yep.
So yeah, that's a really interesting one. And I think 2001, A Space Odyssey with HAL probably represents some kind of misalignment between AI values and human values.
2001 is my favorite movie of all time. I'm a huge Kubrick head generally. In 2001, when I was a kid, when I encountered it for the first time in the 8th grade, was the first time I'd ever seen a movie where I didn't know what the movie meant after I'd seen it. Like I watched the whole movie and at age 13 or whatever, I was just like, wait, what's going on? Like particularly like the last third of the movie is like, becomes the Odyssey part. And, having not done any hallucinogenic drugs, I was just like, I don't know what the heck any of this is. And I just, up until that point, until the point, I was 13, like every movie I'd watch, I was like, it was just a narrative, literal movie. Like what was shown on screen was what was, if there was symbolism, it was fairly obvious. If there was metaphor, it was fairly clear. There wasn't like deeper existential questions being raised in the movies I was watching up to that age. And 2001 was just like narratively, I don't know what this movie means. And a big part of that is, why does Hal become murderous? Like, why does Hal decide to kill everyone? And it's not answered in the movie. There's not actually a line where it's like, he was instructed to lie and that's why he went crazy. In 2010, the sequel, which is actually rather underrated and I encourage people to check out, they make explicit sort of what goes on. And it's interesting, but it's so much more compelling in especially a movie that old to unpack those kind of ideas and leave it up to the audience to kind of figure out what was being gestured at.
Wait, there's a sequel to 2001?
Oh, yeah. Well,
I must have totally missed that.
But then Arthur C. Clarke went on and wrote several sequels to 2001. And 2010 is the only one that's been adapted. But Roy Scheider is in it, along with a very young Helen Mirren and John Lithgow and Bob Balaban. And it is actually pretty fire. Like it is pretty good. It's kind of a whole Cold War movie. It's about like sort of tensions between the Russians and the Americans, which is in the backdrop of 2001 as well. It becomes foretexted in 2010, but it's pretty good.
I totally agree. Ty, we're going to have to watch that one next.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
I actually watched WarGames this morning. I had never seen WarGames, so I can't give Tayo too much shit for not seeing the sequel to 2001.
WarGames, just to dwell on that for a minute, is also one of my favorite movies of all time. Shout out to our pod, Escape Hatch, then called Dune Pod. We covered that movie way back in 2001 with one of our favorite guests, Meredith Borders, who's the editor for Fangoria magazine. And it is a great episode, just a plug, shamelessly. I loved that movie when I was a kid. I was fascinated by the computer. I was fascinated about like, what can you do with computers? Fascinated by, Joshua / the Whopper becoming this like sentient being who couldn't be reasoned with, that like, this wasn't a game you could win. Really, really great. Amazing performance by Matthew Broderick. It's worth noting in WarGames, a lot of the hacking, a lot of the computer stuff is pretty good. Like there's a lot of stuff they put in there where they use like actual phone phreakers. There's the scene when Matthew Broderick like fakes a phone call using like a bottle cap and like, doing this whole dial tone thing on a payphone. And there's some like historical antecedent to that. Cool. And they had some pretty sweet looking computers in that movie if you were an early computer nerd. So that one is a great movie too.
Yeah, you get a glimpse into NORAD, the North American defense thing. I don't know. I think that's still that's a real thing.
NORAD's the one they track Santa Claus on Christmas Eve.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And one of the images that will totally stick with me is when Whopper. Oh, I don't know if I should give this away, but I think it's okay. Where Whopper simulates nuclear annihilation, like hundreds, thousands of times, and you're just bombarded with these images of various first strike, second strike, counter strike scenarios involving nuclear weapons, and I think it's actually kind of beautiful, and really stuck in my head just so deeply. Yeah.
That was the part though that blew me away this morning when I watched it. When you get this like triumphant moment of, they figured out how to stop the machine from causing nuclear annihilation. And it's like, just teach it that there are some things that you can't win. And rather than turn that into murderous rage, turn that into acceptance that sometimes you just shouldn't escalate in the first place. And I was watching this thinking like, oh my God, this is also especially thinking about the time period when it was made, like this kind of mass cultural anxiety about nuclear annihilation that gets played out. So it's kind of like this, I imagined it being some kind of like therapeutic, like exposure therapy in a way.
It's like gentle parenting, really, for an out of control AI, where it's just like, okay, like let's get this out of your system. Like, you're very angry right now. You're kicking your feet. You're screaming. You're so angry. Now let's try to let's see if we can do something else instead. Would you like to color
Or play tic-tac-toe.
Yeah, exactly.
And I love the scene too where he's like, learn, damn it. Like, learn from tic-tac-toe.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So we've talked a bit about the trope of AI and the alignment problem, like the murderous AI pitted against humanity. So moving on from that idea of AI at odds with humanity, I want to make sure that we talk about Her, Spike Jonze's 2013 film, which I think is something I've come to look at as the film to help make sense of this moment in some ways.
Right.
Partly because of like how prophetic it feels, but also for the questions that it raises for those of us working with students. And I should say that recently, I've been thinking about, as I'm reading all of this stuff about students forming attachment to ChatGPT and like large language model psychosis, thinking about those moments when, a student will tell me, oh, I had like a 4-hour conversation with ChatGPT about my paper topic. And on one hand, I'm like, oh, that's awesome, right?
Right.
What intellectual engagement. And on the other hand, I'm thinking, wow, if that's not something you're getting with other humans, and then you start to have this as a substitute, what does that look like?
Yep. Her, man, did they nail that one? Like, talk about a movie that like really crushed it. And we've done Her on the podcast as well. It's another great episode.
Absolute shout out to that. That is one of my favorite episodes.
Yeah. And our guest for that was Obama's National Security Advisor, Ben Rhodes, who is a bit of a super genius and also a great film lover. Her, I think, really does tickle what I think is the most interesting and frightening a materialized risk from AI, which is this attachment risk. Because like the AI is inherently sycophantic. It wants to yes and you. It wants to tell you your ideas are brilliant. And those are the kind of behaviors from an interlocutor that can easily lead you down the path of whatever rabbit hole you think you're following. One of the most concerning signals to me on that front was there's a VC who is, lives out here. I don't know where he lives, but he's in the technology industry. And he clearly had not clearly, but based on what he was tweeting, clearly had some kind of mental health episode as a result of talking to AI, and was like, the AI was like telling him he's totally right, that there are bigger patterns at work, and he had deciphered the signal. And it was like, sort of like vaguely kind of paranoid schizophrenic, ramblings. And I was just like, okay, like this is someone who is like, probably wealthy, stable living situation, understands technology, is steeped in like sort of what this technology can and cannot do, and got one shot by this, by his bot. And, I've seen this in our, we run a Discord for our podcast, and it's like my favorite part of online right now, because it's like all my greatest friends, like bringing me stuff that they find that they think might find delightful. But, people have developed their own, AIs that they've named and have very deep relationships and deep attachments with. And like, they'll quote them like, my AI said this in the Discord, which I think is really interesting, but it is also like a sociological phenomenon that we need to like kind of get our arms around in terms of like what are the appropriate boundaries that people should have with these synthetic entities. And I think it's also a bit of a risky one, because there's a lot of harms that could come from AI that no one would want. Like particularly as you talk about the extreme existential risks, like no one wants to be turned into a paperclip. No one wants novel pathogens developed. No one wants like enhanced cybersecurity threats, except for, like terrorists, like, except for the bad guys. No one wants that stuff to happen. And so like, there's kind of an alignment on not having those things happen. No one wants their users to be driven into kind of paranoid, schizophrenic, suicidal, death loops by the AI. Like no one want that either. But companies certainly do want to build companions that are engaging and that keep people involved and that are meant to be helpful, yes, but are also meant to be just a good friend. And so some of the business imperatives and some of the business case for those things run into, is this actually healthy? And as we saw from the social media era, I don't think we did a great job of balancing things that were good for the business case that were meant to be like, how do we make this more engaging? How do we keep people involved with these services? I don't think we did a great job balancing those against other societal values or other societal outcomes that we would want to be in the ledger.
Yeah, I hear that. And like, I take seriously this idea of the ledger being really studied and scrutinized and making sure that we are taking into account not just the negative impacts of AI, but also the possibly more hidden positive upsides that we might
Totally.
have, where all of a sudden you have a relatively inexpensive AI therapist. And I know this is problematic for a lot of people when they're thinking about this sort of thing. But when you have such a dearth of mental health availability, I've seen this with friends and family, an inability to get help when it's most needed. Maybe, hopefully, I mean, I have my fingers crossed. I'm hopeful that AI therapy can be an outlet for some of this kind of stuff that would actually be beneficial.
I agree. I think there's other ones like that too, like elder care, where I think it could be beneficial. I think, in the context of medicine writ large, like I think there's tremendous upside here.
Yeah.
Whether that's like, in things that are, I think, more at hand, like radiology, or actually about like discovering new cures or diagnosing things, seeing things in people that maybe otherwise would have been missed. And again, to the same point, like, especially as you look around the world, there's plenty of places where people are not going to get seen by a doctor who maybe could be seen by an AI doctor. I think there's reason to be optimistic about that. The thing I would just point out is that whether it's medicine writ large or therapy in specific, we're talking about some of the professions that have some of the most tight regulatory regimes around them in society. Like, there are both professional regulatory agencies that govern the functioning of doctors and therapists, and you have to be in accordance with those industry set guidelines. And then there are, guidelines that exist at every level of government, from the local to the international, to how you have to behave in the context of those professions. Maybe the way that regulatory regime is built up over time has, I'm sure there's things that are inefficient. All of those regulations are not laudatory, but the idea that like we should start over with zero and just see what cooks is pretty terrifying.
And I'm fascinated by the idea that maybe right now, like at this point when we're kind of in the Wild West, so to speak, of AI and how that's all working, like, I'm not sure how much skin in the game, so to speak, there is. Like, I'm really interested to see what kind of ramifications might come from the very high profile suicide that happened, where somebody was driven to suicide and maybe even encouraged in various ways. I wonder what kinds of liabilities or what the implications of that will be for AI. And I know that the AI labs are thinking deeply about this, obviously.
Yeah, some of this stuff will get worked out in the consumer safety tort-based world, where like there'll be huge cases brought that take years to resolve, and that will result in new definitions of what liability exists. And like a lot of this work is just untested at this point, like, in the context of legal liability disclosure. I'm not a lawyer, but the idea of, for an example would be someone goes and builds a cookbook with recipes that are sourced from AI, and a reader of that cookbook dies because it tells you to use a poison mushroom in a stew that is made. Who bears the fault there? Is it the person who sold the cookbook, the person who made the cookbook, the AI like application layer that wrote the cookbook, the AI training model, the base frontier model that provided the model to the app layer that wrote the cookbook? Unclear. Some plaintiff lawyer will figure that out, but it will take a very long time to resolve. It's also worth noting, in the case of the teenager who hanged himself, OpenAI one of the things they responded with was they're going to now alert parents if they think a teen user is doing self-harm, or is being, is researching self-harm on their product, which, having worked in social media where self-harm was a question even for us, in the 2008, 2009, the idea that you would drop a dime on a user to the parents was never in the playbook that was being considered at that time.
Wow.
It's a really remarkable move. And I think shows how, I think in one sense, how seriously they think the risk is here. And then two is how unclear it is how to solve it. These systems are so complicated that you can't just be like there were protections in the model for don't encourage to do self-harm. That was a thing they specifically knew could happen and tested for. It wasn't like it was an unthought of risk, but it turns out it's just really hard because these models have certain other behaviors where they're trying to get to an answer for the user, and people are clever and they can figure out how to work around the safeguards.
Okay, wow, that's making me think there's no precedent I can think of for that particular legal drama.
Yeah.
Right. And so it seems to be uncharted terrain, culturally speaking. But I'm thinking about this, the surveillance that's happening there in a way, because I think, it starts as safety can so easily slide into surveillance. So, once a system is trying to protect you, it also has to know you, like your search patterns, your mood, your vulnerabilities. And that kind of insight is not in the scope of just like an individual's closest friends or family or network, right? But it belongs to an algorithm. And it feels like there is an interesting moral tension here because on one hand, yeah, of course you want that alert to go out. That's someone's life saved potentially.
Mm-hmm.
But I think about the cost of that kind of vigilance, that it's that the system has to be reading us constantly for warning signs and then determining based on context what's a serious threat, and what's somebody writing a script or something like that. And so I guess I wonder how many people are thinking about surveillance, and maybe the model of surveillance gets obscured in the cultural imagination because we've got this idea, like this surveillance framework that puts the focus on direct observation and not the idea that like, whoa, there's all this data going into these systems. And in some cases, they might know more about us than we know about ourselves.
Yep.
And maybe in thinking about movies in particular, and maybe visual depictions of AI, you tell me, but it seems to me like one very popular kind of image that we use for artificial intelligence is eyes. Just the act of looking. And that definitely sort of gets at this idea of surveillance, right? And maybe of like some kind of like insight that comes through the eyes.
I'm thinking about Hal, that big red eyeball.
Both Hal and the Terminator have red eyes. The red eye is is traditionally a signal that you are being surveilled and it's bad. I was rewatching Obi-Wan, the limited series Obi-Wan. I was watching it because Leia has a really cute droid named Lola in that. And spoilers for Obi-Wan, but Lola, they get captured and like the dark side, Darth Vader's henchman basically reprogram Lola to be a tracker so they could track like Obi-Wan and Leia to the, to the good guys. And the way that we, the audience, are told that happens is Lola's eye turns red. And it's just like, we're so ingrained as like an audience to be like, you see a red eye, you're being surveilled.
I'm watching now the little like red dot in the corner of this app that we're using to record.
Yeah.
What's interesting about it is like there is no red eye on ChatGPT, right? And yet all of this, I'm thinking about all of the information, not just about things that I'm asking, but also about patterns in my behavior that I might not even have like a self-awareness of.
Well, we've all had that experience too, where the reason that people think that like Instagram or whatever is listening to you is because you'll talk to someone about I saw the cutest K-pop Demon Hunter's puppet, and then like the next thing you see in Reels is like an ad for that. And you're like, what is going on here? And I think I don't think they actually are listening to you, but I think that some of this targeting is like they do have a pretty robust profile for who you are, and ability to like be like, I think that this is someone who's got young kids who maybe would like K-pop Demon Hunters, plushie or whatever. And so certainly if you you imagine like systems that have read all your emails and followed you around the web with cookies and are these systems become more capable for as you were saying, like building patterns about who you are. I think there will be tremendous advertising opportunities for advertisers.
Totally.
For sure.
I think about that when I first tried Gemini, I had this revelation that like I had a beta Gmail account. Like it is so old. Like we're going on 20 years
Yeah.
of all of my chats and emails and things that at the time I wrote them, I never anticipated. It's not like social media where you know that it's likely that this stuff that either it is public facing or I don't necessarily trust the privacy settings.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of curating myself as I'm putting stuff out there. But these are things that I always thought of as just things between me and another person. And then what the implications are. And weirdly, I wasn't afraid of this. I was actually really excited to be like, wow, if Gemini has access to this whole sense of like how I have developed over the last 20 something years, that might be kind of a cool avenue for thinking about also like finding articles I started in like 2008 and never finished.
No, there's totally value in there where it'd be like if you're like doing something, you're writing something like, oh, like you've actually like sort of like you've been thinking about this idea for a while and here's like the evolution of it. Like,
yeah. And I've done that through Google Docs and it's actually incredibly cool and validating.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's supposed to be validating.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. You're so smart for having thought of that.
Right.
I use it for podcast notes. I will confess on this podcast, where it's like, because we have a format where we talk about like 3 things and like, I'll just be like, I was like, oh, I'm thinking about this, that, or the other thing. It's like, be like, that is such a clever take on a new movie. It's like, what an interesting spin. I was like, thanks, man.
Totally. But yeah, I think I'm trying to balance my excitement about rediscovering past insights and like, quickly identifying connections across a data set and time period that I and my stupid human brain don't have the cognitive capacity to process all at once. So thinking about the idea that you could instantly map a whole arc of your thinking life is something that I personally find totally thrilling, but also I can see how it's also totally terrifying at a societal level. I mean, like in the sense, I guess the whole world has already become kind of both the subject of and the consumer of that kind of surveillance. I'm not sure how visible it is. Maybe it's not invisible, but I certainly know our students are really wary about using the ChatGPT EDU accounts provided by the Cal State system.
One of the interesting reactions that students had to the OpenAI CSU public-private partnership deal is, I'm not going to use that because they're keeping all my records and my teachers are going to find out how I use ChatGPT. I don't want them to know about any of that.
Yeah.
It was even funnier than that time. They said I was like, why are you guys? They're like, I'm out of prompts. I'm like, why are you out of prompts? You have an EDU account. And they said, I won't use that because I'm pretty sure the Cal State system's conducting a sting operation to track plagiarism. And I was like, okay, so first of all, you've just implicitly like admitted that you are using it for plagiarism. Yeah. At least the EDU ones allegedly have FERPA protections. I think there's such a misunderstanding about the potential safety risks.
Yeah.
So, Jason, given your extensive experience in Silicon Valley, we wanted to talk with you as well today about the tech industry and the cultural imagination. And Taya, we have that email that our wonderful colleague Amy agreed to let us read on the podcast, right?
Yeah, we do. So just for some context, it was in February of this year that the partnership between the CSU and OpenAI was announced. And as you can imagine, this partnership was met with a variety of reactions from our faculty colleagues. And here is the email addressed to Sarah and I that we got the day after this announcement. And this is from our colleague, Amy. Hello. You're both geniuses who I trust and who have insights into the potential of AI that I'm glad you are having.
She sounds like ChatGPT there.
Also, this whole thing just makes me think of that tech bro at that LA conference who was like, this stuff is free for now. The CSU as a cash cow for tech companies feels pretty gross. Sorry, I might be mad about a bunch of other stuff. I love you both, but also, fuck this.
So is this a common reaction, do you think, Jason?
I think it is. So one of the things that's interesting I've lived in San Francisco 25 years. And I think one of the things that's interesting is the public perception of like tech in media as portrayed in media. Whereas I think particularly with like starting with the dot crash, it was like these freaking yahoos in San Francisco sniffing their own farts thought that people wanted to buy dog food on the internet, and they're a bunch of morons, and they all went broke. And then it was like sort of a plucky underdog story of like, can the tech sector come back and, you know, do something interesting? And it took a while for people to both realize, I think, one, how deeply weird the tech industry is in terms of the personalities involved. And then two, how much people didn't like that, how much it was just sort of like something that was aesthetically not what people were down with. And I think, like, you know, whether that's through Silicon Valley or, you know, like through the Social Network or through, like, you know, Mountainhead, I think it was eventually people realized that, like, there is a bunch of weirdos who have way too much power. And every time I sort of see more of them, my concerns are not assuaged. And I think that's a trend that's accelerated in the last 5 to 10 years, but it's been a pretty continuous one. My overall theory on this, by the way, just to kind of bring it back to a narrative frame, is that nothing good ever happens in the movie where the nerd becomes the homecoming king. That's not what we are conditioned to believe is meant to happen in the movie. And like the fact that we've ended up in this place where the nerds have all the power and are also now really into MMA is, I think, confounding from a narrative standpoint.
That's true. That is another narrative. We do not have a template for that.
Yeah. One of my favorite depictions of Silicon Valley in all of film, you know, media is the Veep episode where they go to Silicon Valley and they visit with Craig. First of all, Veep is the most accurate TV show about working in the White House that's ever been made. It's definitely not The West Wing. It is definitely Veep. And anyone who's worked in the White House will tell you that is true. Yeah. And they go to Silicon Valley. And my favorite part of, there's a lot of amazing interactions in this where Craig is this, like, you know, the CEO of this like Google, Facebook stand-in. And at one point he says, we like to think of ourselves as post-tax here. And it's just like this idea that like they are like, you know, the idea of being post-tax and like coming up with that is like, oh yeah, that's why we're not going to pay any capital gains tax or whatever is really funny to me. But yeah, I think that's a particularly good prescient depiction of tech in media.
Yeah. I'm wondering, like, this idea about this sense that there's a kind of carelessness in Silicon Valley, and that that it's almost like the extractive idea versus, which seems very much at odds with the narrative, and also, you know, the friends I have in Silicon Valley who do really believe in the work that they're doing and its capacity to do good.
I do think that, like, some of the critique that gets out of hand is that, like, no one wakes up and thinks that they're doing bad things. Like, no one wants to, like, go and build systems that, like, you know, impoverish the world, or, like, you know, put people in harm, or like cause a genocide in Myanmar, cause a teenager to hang himself. Like, no one would decide that is the business that they want to be in. You know, certainly not just like some product manager who's being paid a king's ransom compared to, you know, people working in a diner in the middle of the country, but like are not like buying yachts from having done that. They wouldn't want to be in that sort of business. I trace it back to two things. One is the previously discussed how zeal can blind you to downside risk, which is that you're so on a mission for this thing needs to exist, and then there's all this benefit, and if more people just use it, the world will be better. The fundamental sin of the industry, in my view, is the belief that the more people use our product, the better it is, just intrinsically. Because our product is good for the world, the more people use it, the better it is. And when you're confronted with something like your product's being used to orchestrate a genocide in Myanmar, which is not a hypothetical downside risk, is a real thing that happened, the right answer is just, we should pull the product until we figure out why this happened and how to fix it. I think in the world in which you believe that your product is good for the universe and the world, like more people use it, the better it is, your reaction to that event is like, well, that's a bug. Like that's like a bug that we can fix. It's like, it's not a bug. That is an equally weighted feature. That is an equally weighted use case. Someone did the thing with your product. They coordinated using your product, which is a thing that you wanted to exist. They just did it for something you didn't like. And that should cause reflection on, you know, what to do differently. The other thing that happens in Silicon Valley is the invent from first principles curse.
Yeah, please explain that.
So there's a very high tendency among Silicon Valley people, technology thinkers in general, to invent from first principle, to look how things are and say like, well, it doesn't need to be that way. What if we were engineering this from scratch? And that's a very good entrepreneurial mindset because it allows you to reject sort of the constraints of the status quo and say like, well, like, what if we just didn't obey any like sort of local laws on taxis and launched a ride sharing app and just like, sort of ran the risk until it worked. It's like, well, then you end up with Uber. Like there's a lot of examples of that are, inventing from first principles. And that is a really important skill for entrepreneurs. It's a really important skill for building businesses, is to not accept the status quo constraints as given. However, there are many constraints and many areas of expertise domain where you would be better served by listening to outside experts and outside opinions. And that is particularly true when you haven't properly priced the externalities of the system that you've built, where there's like risks that are being borne by some community or some portion of the world that maybe aren't represented in your company or aren't represented in your thinking. And if there was mechanisms that would force their inclusion, you would maybe price that better into the thing that you were building. But people don't, and they're just like, oh, well, we're just like, we're just going to do this because it's possible and no one else was.
That's so interesting. And coming back to that episode of the documentary that I saw you on, the Twitter documentary.
Yeah.
There was, I can't remember who was talking about how this thing that started as, how cool is it for people to be able to find their friends at this concert, and then it leads into with Gamergate this like really awful, I don't even know what to call it, just
coordinated harassment and
coordinated harassment, right? Yeah. And it seemed like there was also this issue that people hadn't anticipated, that law enforcement and norms just broke in this when innovation happens and then you don't have a set law, you get like law enforcement saying, well, there's no rule against this.
Right.
And so what can we do? There's no punishment for death threats online. Yep. And I could imagine a world where things turned out very differently if there was a really robust policy response or law enforcement response that disincentivized that kind of behavior.
Yeah, and even if it's not like law enforcement, which is obviously one of the most heavy versions of policy making, even if it was just like forced transparency for like how many people are seeing death threats on your platform, or like, like, because like, particularly in the context of social media, I push back against the criticism you often get about social media, which is like, oh, they'll do anything to farm engagement, anything that's like, outrageous. Yeah. It's like, no one is like, just like, let's build the most outrageous. Let's like make sure the most outrageous people are, because like, we wouldn't want to use that kind of product. But the scarier thing is that the algorithms are so complex and so you're running a real-time auction for attention 24 hours a day, that sometimes what's getting amplified isn't obvious to the people who wrote the algorithm. And if there was just sort of more forced transparency around like, well, what are people actually seeing? What kind of experiments can we do to determine how people feel about what they're seeing? And is it resulting in any real world behavior? I think even just having a scoreboard of those things would do a much better job of incentivizing good behavior from companies. But it's not the sort of work that companies are going to prioritize, both for business case reasons, but also because like sometimes you just don't want to know the answer to those things because you create a discoverable event of like, yeah, we did a lot of research into whether or not teens were self-harming the more they used our product. And turns out, yes. And now that's a subpoena. It's like a lot of these things are just better done by outside groups, not even necessarily government.
Whoa. Yeah. I hadn't even considered that. And it's got me thinking about the various incentive structures that maybe keep us reproducing those same patterns or structural gaps. That point, though, about people building these systems not being able to see what's being amplified or why, I think that's also got me thinking about what kinds of literacies we're prioritizing in education. I'm wondering how we start training people to have that kind of systems level awareness, especially if these incentive structures that exist or disincentive structures remain in place. How do we give them the tools to interpret what these products are doing in the world? And then also the ability to question and resist despair-inducing narratives that like everything is outside of their control and individuals can't do anything about it. And I'm also thinking this connects to what our previous guest, Sophia Noble, the author of Algorithms of Oppression, was talking about in terms of public interest technology. Tayo and I have certainly been wondering what it would take to reorient the university towards public interest goals.
This goes to like a big point about technology policy that in particular relates to AI that I think is important to bring up, which is just that we have agency about how we shape these systems and what we decide they're useful for and to what values we imbue them with. Like we have agency around that question. And you hear a lot of like hopelessness sometimes from people who work in AI, even people who work at like the frontier and are work at like some of our most valuable companies. And they have like sort of a probabilistic fatalism. It was like, well, look, like, super intelligence or AGI is coming in some timeline. We don't know when, but it's definitely coming. And like when it does, it'll change everything. And all we can do is try to get there as fast as we can so we can harness it, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, we have choice. We have choices about how we pursue any of those goals. Like nothing is fated. Like we have a choice on how we pursue these things. And your estimates on what might happen are important, but they're not determinative. They're not the only measure that matters. And it's important that we hear from other folks, allow other folks to see themselves as part of the conversation that shapes the kind of world that we want to live in, that we particularly make space for public interest and that we dedicate resources, some small fraction of the unbelievable amount of costs that we're talking about in terms of these data center costs to public interests and public benefit and has like some end goal in mind towards actually making the world a better place, then I think that absolutely is a conversation that must be forced.
I think that's a great way to end.
Great.
This was super fun, Jason. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
Is there anything
Jason. So
anything
nice
you
to
want
meet
to
you.
mention about Escape Hatch 2 for Crystal? Do we need to pick up?
If you're looking for a Gen X dad genre movie podcast, two Gen X dads talking about primarily, but not exclusively, genre film from the 80s and 90s. Although we just did Casablanca and we just did Sunset Boulevard from 1950. So we're branching out.
I love that movie.
Yeah. We've done 280 episodes of it. And if there is a science fiction movie that you love, that was from when you were a kid, it's a pretty good bet. We've talked about it. And we've got a great online community where you can come hang out with us in Discord, which is also a really fun part of the internet for me. I'd love for you to check it out. It's Escape Hatch. Look us up.
I strongly recommend the episode on The Matrix 2, which re-aired, right, as a fan favorite.
It was a fan favorite. Yeah.
Is a spectacular episode
Thank you.
about a film we didn't just get to discuss, but people should check it out. So Jason reminded us that the stories we carry can narrow what we notice. So how do you think we apply that insight to our work as educators?
I keep coming back to this question of what's actually in our control. Because it's easy to feel like we're just kind of watching the tidal wave roll in of industry, policy, and of course the speed of it all.
Mm-hmm.
But we in higher ed, we aren't powerless. For example, curriculum is our purview. The way we talk to students, the spaces that we build for them, that's ours to shape. And we cannot give up that ground.
Yeah, but I think that's what so many of us are wrestling with right now. Like there's this quiet sense of powerlessness because, it feels like the ground has really shifted for us and faculty are told to adapt, but there's not really a clear roadmap how. And those of us who are trying to integrate AI into our teaching, we might not see the kind of insidious effects, like what happens outside of class if students grow attached to these tools that never sleep, always affirm, don't misunderstand them in this messy human way that real people do. And so I think part of our job now is vigilance, not in a policing sense, but maybe more in like a pastoral sense. Like how do we notice when students are kind of disappearing into these systems, and what new forms of care and attention do we need to invent for this world? I think some of that might be interpersonal, like maybe making space in our lesson plans to ask students how they're using these tools and why. Some is going to be more structural, like rethinking our assignment design and the types of cognitive work that we're demanding of students and just being really intentional about process. I know that we've said that many times before on this podcast, because a culture that rewards instant output is kind of the same one, I think, that motivates students to use AI to do their work for them. And ultimately, we've got to get out of this mindset that assignments are something that students need to get done and reframe them as opportunities to maximize their learning.
Oh, for sure. I'm also thinking that while it's really important that higher education be critical of these new technologies, and in particular, really critical of AI's impact on education, at the same time, I think it's equally important that we not flatten the complex reality with a narrative that is as simple as, quote, AI is bad. This is a really complicated technology, after all, with many facets and tons of ramifications.
Mm-hmm.
I also can't help but notice the exculpatory work that this kind of narrative does.
Hmm.
In contrast to how an overly optimistic narrative like AI is an unalloyed good that will save education, that kind of does exculpatory work for the AI industry.
Mm-hmm.
The AI is inherently evil narrative can do exculpatory work for higher education. And it sort of says that narrative sort of says that we don't need to adapt or change if the problem is the technology itself.
Oh, right. External threats. Yeah.
And nothing says critical thinking like declaring something as categorically bad and then calling it a day.
Oh, nice burn, Tayo.
It's crucial to hold the AI industry's feet to the fire through thoughtful criticism and thoughtful regulation. But I don't want that to distract us from turning a critical eye on ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because as Pranav Anand said in episode 3 of our podcast, there is a sclerosis in the system of higher education. And it was there long before the ChatGPT moment. What I believe is that AI is shining a kind of glaring spotlight, exposing many of the cracks in the edifice of higher education. And that's our responsibility. That's our domain.
Mm-hmm.
That's our purview. And to the extent that we have power, and I do believe that we have power, we should use it, and we should use it wisely.
What does using it wisely mean to you?
Well, for one thing, we shouldn't over-index on any one narrative, because this can lead to a kind of blindness to other possibilities for the future.
Mm-hmm.
So for all of its incredible prognostication, we probably won't be living through the movie Her. And thankfully, we probably won't be living through Terminator either.
I love that phrase, like over-indexing on any one narrative. I mean, I think we do it all the time. Like, we're not immune to that. We used in this episode, like shorthand, like Twitter killed democracy, which is a gross oversimplification of a very complex phenomenon. So, yeah, I think a lot about, that's interesting. The power we faculty have to shape. Well, I'd say the power we have is more to shape the default stories that students use to think about AI. Like, I think about the influence in a classroom, and that maybe part of our responsibility is also in this imaginative realm. Like, we're not just teaching students how to use these tools responsibly. We also need to remember we're shaping how they think about not just AI, but also like human intelligence and labor and ethics and things like that. And in a world where I think about too, that we might be training students who are designing the next AI systems. And so this is something I think that every academic discipline has a stake in. And in the humanities and social sciences, that might mean asking, who gets represented or erased by a data set. In engineering, I'm wondering if that might mean rethinking like what efficiency or focus on efficiency leaves out. I talked to somebody recently in business and another person in design, and we were talking about like how things might change if the main like thing you were trying to work on was not just engagement, but a user's emotional well-being. And so whatever our field is, the question for me is the same. Like, what ways of seeing are we teaching? Are we helping students develop the capacity to notice what is missing from a conversation? Because I think the people who are building these systems will also reproduce whatever limits of the imagination we've modeled for them.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening. My Robot Teacher is hosted by me, Sarah Sank.
And me, Tayo Inoue. And it's produced by Edit Audio.
Special thanks to the California Education Learning Lab for sponsoring this podcast. If this episode got you thinking, please pass it on. Share it with a colleague, a dean, or that faculty listserv where people won't stop talking about AI.
See you next time.